The battle was over, and the stars looked falsely serene. The narrator said, Jaxon drifted through wreckage like a pilgrim among gravestones. Jaxon said, victory logged, casualties pending, his voice cracking under the helmet's echo. The flagship's hull glowed with heat scars while rescue beacons pulsed like tired hearts. He replayed a recorded laugh from home and let it pierce his composure. The narrator said, praise erupted on open channels, but his silence devoured it. Admiral Voren said, accept the honors, Captain, the calm sizzling with an edge colder than pride. Jaxon said later, and severed the feed. A freighted dread stalked him into the jump corridor. The narrator said, he set course for the colony, craving warmth and cinnamon tea. The warning buoy flared red against the black. Andis, Jaxon said, that's not ours, and the horizon tilted. The landing pads were bare, dust whispering across faded numbers. The narrator said, Jaxon quickened his pace, as if speed could summon the vanished. He pinged the homestead door, but only silence replied. Jaxon said, I'm home, and the word cracked in the air. A mug lay tipped on the counter, a stain of tea clinging stubbornly. The narrator said, absence had weight here, pressing into every corner. He opened a hollow of birthday candles, freezing a smile mid-laugh. Jaxon said, you promised you'd wait, though no such promise had existed. A faint scorch marked the threshold, shape wrong, scent alien. The narrator said, he tasted copper in the air, and fear wrapped his throat. He sensed to the local grid, and ghosts answered. The narrator said, logs stuttered, frames missing like teeth. Neighbor cams flickered, lamps bowing to invisible hands. Jaxon said, who touched my house, his voice rough. A child's toy rolled past, nudged by memory's phantom. The narrator said, he traced the vanish to a single pulse at 302. A buoy signature overlapped military bands like elegant cruelty. Jaxon said, Voren would never, but doubt sliced through. The comm chimed with a private route he hadn't requested. The narrator said, a shadow sent coordinates without a demand, as if pity had grown fingers. The private route ended beneath the comm spire where pigeons once nested. The narrator said, static scraped his ear like dry leaves. A voice without name carried weight like prophecy. Nyx said, you will not like the answer, and the sky leaned closer. Jaxon said, try me, his hand hovering near the holster. The spire's maintenance hatch bled ozone. The narrator said, codes felt familiar, a song from war days. Packet unfolded, its origin cruelly clear. Jaxon said, flagship relay, and the world narrowed. The narrator said, truth shimmered like heat over asphalt, painful and sure. He watched the origin stamp repeat until pride curdled. The narrator said, he had won a war and opened a door. Admiral Voren said, only strength keeps peace, a memory now bitter. Jaxon said, my victory paid the toll, shrinking beneath the words. The walls seemed to lean away from him. The narrator said grief sharpened into purpose like a blade on stone. He closed the candle hollow, letting darkness claim the room. Nyx said, I can get you inside, her voice lined with risk. Jaxon said, then we start now, the decision heavy. The narrator said, hope did not return, but direction did, moving like a storm. The observatory chapel hummed with low harmonics as dust swam in skylight. The narrator said, Jaxon waited among broken pews and star charts. Elara Quinn said, you are not the sum of this grief, and set a hand on the rail. Jaxon said, my home is a question with teeth, and his gaze stayed fixed upward. The narrator said, she listened like a harbor taking waves in winter. Elara Quinn said, follow the signal, not the shame, and slid a data wafer across. Nyx said, the path cuts through Voren's shadow from the doorway's hush. Jaxon said, then we walk where he thinks we will kneel. The narrator said, resolve rose slow, like a tide ignoring the moon. Elara Quinn said, carry a light that does not burn you. The bell tone fell once, and the room exhaled. The medbay whispered antiseptic and old thunder. The narrator said, Rhea lay beneath a quilt of sensor lines. Rhea said, they came like fog and sang in numbers, and her eyes flinched. Nix, said Pulse, was at 302 across 3 blocks, tapping a chart. Jaxon said, did they speak our names? And fear met duty in his throat. The narrator said, memory shook her like a door in wind. Rhea said, a buoy wore the fleet's uniform and smiled without a face. Elara Quinn said, breathe, and place the moments in order, her voice a metronome. Rhea, said the red glyph turned white, and everything bent inward. Jaxon said, a relay dressed as a rescue, and the truth bruised clean. The monitors steadied as grief found a label. The broadcast tower painted the night with policy and threat. The narrator said, Vorn addressed the council with a smile trained to cut. Admiral Vorn said, security demands obedience, and the stars seem to hold their breath. Jaxon said, he is laying rails for a train already rolling, teeth set. Nix said 3 systems locked their gates after his speech, scanning feeds. The narrator said, commerce shuddered like a net pulled too tight. Vorn said, emergency measures will be merciful and brief, voice like glass. Elara Quinn said, mercy without limits is a leash, and closed her eyes. Jaxon said, he is hiding a corridor in the law, and marked points on a map. The signal carried applause that sounded like hollow rain. The hangar smelled of ozone and new lies. The narrator said, Kale waited by a crate, marked humanitarian aid. Kale said, your family was seen boarding a safe transport, and let the word safe linger. Jaxon said, seen by whom, while the floor hummed with distant trolleys. Nix said, manifest is forged, but elegant, as she traced ghost ink. The narrator said, Kale's smile folded like a blade returning home. Kale said, bring me Voron's access shard, and I bring you faces. Jaxon said, you were crew, and the ache grew teeth. Kale said, I still am to myself, and shrugged a bright shrug. The narrator said, trust took a step back and did not return. The crate kept breathing cold air, like a lie that practiced. The night bent around the homestead like a vow spoken too late. The narrator said, Jaxon replayed candles and laughter until the pixels frayed. Elara Quinn said, grief is not a compass, and set tea on the table. Jaxon said, then I will be my own north, and the words steadied. Nick said, Kale's bait stinks of Voron's kitchens, and folded her map. The narrator said, memory flickered, revealing corridors built from his victories. Jaxon said, I gave him the parts, and he built a cage, breath thin. Elara Quinn said, you can unmake what you made, but not alone. Jaxon said, then we gather hands that do not tremble, and stood. The narrator said, outside, the wind practiced saying their names. The house did not answer, but the plan began to breathe. The reconnaissance drone skimmed the asteroid's crust like a skater on thin ice. The narrator said, Jaxon's ship hovered in the shadow of fractured rock. Nix said, sensors show nothing, but nothing is never empty. Her voice tight. Jaxon said, then something waits between the blinks. The narrator said, silence pressed close, heavier than vacuum. A static pulse bloomed, then vanished. Elara Quinn said, that is a false trail. Too clean, too easy. Jaxon said, Voron wants us chasing ghosts while he moves the board. The narrator said, a comet's tail swept past, scattering light like glass dust. Nix said, we need proof before the next gate locks. Jaxon said, we take the risk or we lose the thread. The narrator said, decision settled like a blade in a sheath. The derelict station groaned as if remembering pain. The narrator said, panels creaked under phantom weight. The tragic hero Marek said, I once guarded this place, voice brittle. Jaxon said, then tell me what stole its breath. The narrator said, Marek's eyes held broken stars. Marek said, Voron promised mercy, but mercy never docked. Nix said, his signature is all over this wreckage. Elara Quinn said, even ruins can testify. Marek said. I left the doors open when the alarms rang. My sin, my sentence. Jaxon said, your testimony might save more than you lost. The narrator said, a distant hull clatter suggested they were not alone. The hidden message unfolded like origami in their hands. The narrator said, coordinates burned through static on an unlisted band. Nick said, this is a trap gift wrapped as salvation. Jaxon said, or it's the only path left. The narrator said, the hidden ally watched from shadows unseen. A faint voice whispered over the calm, you are closer than you think. Elara Quinn said, whoever they are, they know our scars. Jaxon said, then they know how to cut deeper. The narrator said, a lone star flared outside, painting them in gold. Nick said, we follow, but knives drawn. Jaxon said, agreed, hope tempered by steel. The narrator said, the message flickered out like a heartbeat. The ambush arrived silent, like guilt in the dark. The narrator said, drones burst from shadowed cliffs, firing tracer rounds that cut the black. Jaxon said, evasive pattern delta, as alarms wailed. Nick said, two on the aft, they're hurting us. The narrator said, metal screamed as a glancing hit shook the hull. Marek said, hold your course, I'll reroute power. Elara Quinn said, the trap is confirmation. Voron is watching. Jaxon said, then let him see us survive. The narrator said, the ship spun, starlight smearing into violent streaks. Nick said, weapons hot, sending them back to the void. The narrator said, their breath matched the drumbeat of impacts. The ship drifted in hiding, scars glowing faintly. The narrator said, Jaxon stood in the darkened bay, helmet under his arm. Nick said, we almost became more wreckage, breath sharp. Jaxon said, almost is enough for today. The narrator said, silence folded around them like mourning cloth. Marek said, this fight isn't yours alone, voice cracking. Elara Quinn said, your fear does not diminish your strength. Jaxon said, fear keeps me honest, but it steals my sleep. The narrator said, stars glimmered beyond the viewport, uncaring witnesses. Nick said, then we hold each other awake. Jaxon said, until we find them. The narrator said, purpose stitched his fractures, one fragile thread at a time. The artifact chamber pulsed with an alien heartbeat. The narrator said, glass spires rose like frozen lightning around a dais of light. Nick said, this wasn't built by Voron's kind, awe softening her tone. Jaxon said, but he knew it was here. The narrator said, symbols drifted across the walls like migrating stars. Elara Quinn said, legends speak of gates that rewrite destinies. Jaxon said, if this connects to my family, then his victory was no victory at all. The narrator said, a hum filled their bones, resonant and uninvited. Nick said, the coordinates match your colony's path. He planned this long ago. Jaxon said, then this is the thread we pull, until his empire unravels. The narrator said, the artifact pulsed once, as if agreeing. The betrayer's face flickered on the comm like a ghost refusing form. The narrator said, Kale's grin held triumph and regret. Kale said, you always saw me as background noise. Jaxon said, you earned trust, then sold it. The narrator said, static hissed between their words like venom. Kale said, I saw the cracks before anyone else and used them. Nick said, you used families as bargaining chips. Kale said, I used what Voron would destroy anyway. The narrator said betrayal landed like a physical blow, heavier than gunfire. Elara Quinn said, choices carve the shapes we wear forever. Jaxon said, then wear this shape well, it will be all you have. The narrator said, Kale's signal cut, leaving silence sharp as broken glass. The Galactic Council chamber glittered like a jewel hiding rot. The narrator said, Voron's voice was silk wrapped around steel. Admiral Voron said, the galaxy bleeds for weak leadership. Stand with me. The narrator said, delegates leaned forward, spellbound by the serpent. Nix whispered, He's making conquest sound like salvation. Jaxon said, they clap for their own chains. Elara Quinn said, even chains can be broken when the lie collapses. The narrator said, the council's applause echoed like thunder without rain. Warren said, security is mercy. Mercy is power. Jaxon said, he just declared war without lifting a weapon. The narrator said, in the balcony's shadows, unseen hands passed sealed orders. The chapel's old bells had been silent for years, but tonight echoes of doubt rang louder. The narrator said, Elara knelt beneath fractured stained glass. Elara Quinn said, faith bends when tested, but it does not break. Nyx said, Vorin twists belief into a weapon. Jaxon said, then we twist it back into hope. The narrator said, dust spiraled in beams of moonlight, tracing their breathing. Elara Quinn said, we hold the line, even if the line moves. Jaxon said, your conviction steadies mine. The narrator said outside, the wind carried distant thunder from Vorin's march. Nyx said, the storm isn't waiting for us. Elara Quinn said, then we meet it halfway. The narrator said, the glass above shimmered like a fractured star map. Jaxon replayed the battle logs, the pattern blooming like a cruel flower. The narrator said, each victory had paved Vorin's ascent. Nyx said, your winds built his throne. Jaxon said, then I'm the architect of my own grief. The narrator said, silence filled the ship, thicker than any vacuum. Elara Quinn said, you can't unwrite the past, but you can edit its ending. Jaxon said, we tear down what we built. The narrator said outside, a comet trailed fire, a silent witness to resolve. Nyx said, let's ensure his empire burns brighter than that tale once. Jaxon said, we move tonight. The narrator said, purpose and regret braided together, forming a single blade. The hidden chamber's walls peeled back, revealing a masked figure cloaked in shadows. The narrator said, the hidden ally stepped into flickering light, secrets heavy on their shoulders. Hidden ally said, I have guided you from the edges, but time runs thin. Jaxon said, then step into the fight, not its margins. The narrator said, a distant hum from the ship's engines underscored the fragile trust. Nyx said, why reveal yourself now? Hidden ally said, because Vorin's next move burns planets. Elara Quinn said, we stand together or we fall separately. The narrator said, the mask caught a shard of starlight, like a confession about to break. Jaxon said, then we move as one. The survivors' quarters were dim, a shrine to unspoken horrors. The narrator said Rhea traced old scars on the table's metal edge. Rhea said, I saw the ancient threat. They do not conquer, they consume. Jaxon said, Vorin courts forces he does not understand. Nyx said, or he understands too well. The narrator said, screens flickered with recordings of ruined worlds. Elara Quinn said, knowledge like this costs blood. Rhea said, they will open every gate and the galaxy will drown. Jaxon said, then we flood him first, with truth and fire. The narrator said, resolve tightened the room's air until it almost cracked. The launch bay roared with engines and desperate prayers. The narrator said, Marek stepped forward, his posture carrying both shame and resolve. Marek said, let me fly the decoy, this is my redemption. Jaxon said, it could be your death. Marek said, it should have been long ago. The narrator said, Nyx tightened her grip on a datapad, jaw set. Elara Quinn said, redemption is not a death wish. Marek said, it's the only wish I have left. Jaxon said, then make it count. The narrator said, the bay light strobed, blessing a broken man's courage. Nyx said, I'll mark your path in the stars. Marek said, find your family, make my end mean something. The fractured crew gathered around a holomap, lit by shifting constellations. The narrator said, lines of possible futures stretched like veins of fire. Hidden ally said, this is where Vorin will expect you to be weakest. Jaxon said. Then we strike where his arrogance blinds him. Nyx said, a fleet this small cannot win a war. Elara Quinn said, but it can win a turning point. The narrator said, their eyes caught reflections of distant galaxies, hope stitched with fear. Rhea said, survivors fight harder than conquerors. Jaxon said, we'll prove it. The narrator said, the stars on the map pulsed, ready for their gamble. Quiet settled before the storm, a fragile breath held by the universe. The narrator said, Jaxon stood beside the emotional catalyst, a child clutching a faded locket. Emotional catalyst said, will they be okay when the stars change? Jaxon said, I'll bring them back or break trying. The narrator said. Nyx looked away, her eyes bright with unspoken fears. Elara Quinn said, even storms end, but scars tell their stories. Hidden ally, said, scars can also guide the way. The narrator said, the distant hum of engines became a heartbeat of destiny. Emotional catalyst said, then promise me the stars will still sing. Jaxon said, they'll sing louder. The narrator said, the crew prepared, bound by purpose stronger than fear. The void erupted with streaks of fire as fleets clashed like titans. The narrator said, Jaxon's ship dove between plasma bursts, weaving survival into chaos. Nyx said, two on our starboard, cutting fast. Jaxon said, brace and roll, don't give them a clean shot. The narrator said, explosions painted the black in violent blooms of orange and teal. Elara Quinn said, signal Marek's decoy vector before it's too late. Hidden ally said, Vorn's flagship is shifting formation, he's closing the net. The narrator said, hull alarms screamed like wounded beasts. Jaxon said, we'll make him choke on his trap. The narrator said, stars wheeled as the battle spiraled into a deadly ballet. The flagship's bridge shimmered with holograms of conquest. The narrator said, Jaxon stormed aboard. Weapon drawn, a storm contained in flesh. Vorn said, you should have bowed when I gave you the galaxy's leash. Jaxon said, you strangled it instead. The narrator said, stars outside flared like distant applause. Vorn said, your family was collateral, the cost of a future worth building. Jaxon said, you built nothing but graves. The narrator said, their footsteps echoed like war drums on steel. Elara Quinn said, Jaxon, don't let rage be your only guide. Jaxon said, rage is all he left me. The narrator said, the galaxy held its breath for the first shot. The betrayer appeared, shadowed by flickering sparks. The narrator said, Kale stepped from the smoke, weapon half lowered, conflict carved into his face. Kale said, I can end this if I choose the right side. Jaxon said, then choose the one with blood on your hands or on your soul. The narrator said, silence cut sharper than any blade. Vorn said, finish him, Kale, and earn your throne. Kale said, you promised safe passage, you lied. Nyx said, liars don't stop lying. The narrator said, Kale's breath trembled like a brittle bridge. Kale said, then I burn the bridge instead. The narrator said, the balance of power shifted with a single heartbeat. The battle's roar faded to a single desperate act. The narrator said, Marek lunged toward the failing reactor core, override codes flashing on his wrist. Marek said, this is where I end my mistakes. Jaxon said, Marek, no, there's another way. The narrator said, the reactor's pulse quickened like a frightened heart. Marek said, not for me. Nyx said, his path was always the hard one. Elara Quinn said, let him choose his redemption. The narrator said, a blinding flash bathed their faces in white fire. Marek said, find your family, Jaxon, make my death count. The narrator said, the ship shuddered as Marek vanished in light. The artifact pulsed in Jaxon's trembling hands, truth heavier than victory. The narrator said, stars outside the viewport swirled like silent witnesses. Jaxon said, it wasn't Vorn alone, it was my own triumph that signed their fate. Nyx said, you couldn't have known. Jaxon said, I should have. The narrator said, The hum of the artifact sang of sacrifices unseen. Elara Quinn said, "Their loss doesn't define your worth." Hidden Ally said, "But it defines the galaxy's path." Jaxon said, "Then I'll carry it, every step." The narrator said, "The battle was won, but the war within him raged unbroken." The battlefield's wreckage drifted silently, monuments to both glory and grief. The narrator said, "Flames flickered out among shattered hulls, their smoke swallowed by the void." Jaxon said, "We won nothing that matters." Nick said, "We lived, and that matters enough for now." The narrator said, "Survivor beacons pulsed weakly like dying stars." Elara Quinn said, "The galaxy has a way of surviving its own mistakes." Hidden Ally said, "Voron's network is crippled but not dead." The narrator said, "Each fragment of debris whispered a name lost to ambition." Rhea said, "Scars will map our future." Jaxon said, "Then we draw the map carefully." The narrator said, "Silence filled the spaces where cheers should have been." The homestead lay quiet under alien constellations. The narrator said, "Jaxon walked its halls like a ghost visiting memories." He traced the scorch mark on the threshold, the last fingerprint of loss. Jaxon said, "I carried victory, but not them." The narrator said, "Shadows of laughter clung to the corners like stubborn spirits." Nick said, "They would want you to breathe, not break." Elara Quinn said, "Grief is proof of love, not its end." The narrator said, "Stars through the window framed his reflection, fractured but standing." Jaxon said, "I'll build something they would have been proud to return to." The narrator said, "Outside, the wind hummed a song only he could hear." The starship's observation bay glowed faintly, galaxies wheeling beyond. The narrator said, "Elara and the Hidden Ally spoke softly, plotting threads of tomorrow." Elara Quinn said, "His heart is broken but not his will." Hidden Ally said, "Voron's remnants will regroup. They always do." The narrator said, "Hope flickered in their quiet words." Elara Quinn said, "Then we give the galaxy something worth believing in." Hidden Ally said, "Secrets can protect, but they can also bind." The narrator said, "Far off, distant meteors stitched silver scars across the dark." Rhea said, "We survived. Let's make survival matter." The narrator said, their voices wove the first lines of a fragile future. The emotional catalyst clutched the locket, standing beside Jaxon beneath alien constellations. The narrator said, "The child's innocence softened the galaxy's edges." Emotional catalyst said, "Will the stars remember them?" Jaxon said, "They already do." The narrator said, Nyx turned away, hiding the glimmer in her eyes. Elara Quinn said, "Loss plants seeds of hope, even in barren soil." The narrator said, "The breeze stirred dust that once held footsteps of family." Hidden Ally said, "Their memory now guards you better than shields." Jaxon said, "Then we guard the future, every fragile spark." The narrator said, "The stars overhead blinked like patient witnesses." The galaxy stretched infinite and unfeeling beyond the viewport. "Ugh." The narrator said, Jaxon stood alone, the artifact's faint glow cradled in his palms. He whispered, a vow no one else would hear. Jaxon said, "I will carry you through every star until the universe remembers." The narrator said, the hum of distant engines mimicked a heartbeat long gone. Nyx watched silently from the doorway, a quiet sentinel. Elara Quinn said, "Some endings are beginnings in disguise," her voice soft as starlight. The narrator said, "Beyond the glass, a comet traced a silver path toward unseen horizons." Jaxon said, "The war within me isn't over, but I will not falter." The narrator said, "The stars blinked, indifferent yet eternal."